My name is Vincent Prangi, and I'm an actuarial assistant in the Global Research and Data Analytics Department here at Reinsurance Group of America. Today I will be presenting on opioid-related mortality and considerations for insurers. Opioid-related mortality in America is a tragedy. Over the past decade, over 300,000 Americans have died from opioid-related overdoses. That said, not all American communities have been impacted in the same way by opioid-related mortality. In order to replace assumptions with a fact-based, data-driven analysis of this evolving situation, this presentation will cover 4 important insights on opioid mortality and how it may affect American insurers. The first of these insights is that opioid-related mortality has risen substantially in the United States in the last decade. This rise in mortality is attributable, at least in part, to the emergence of potent drugs that are changing the landscape of opioid mortality and drug mortality in general in the United States. Furthermore, there are important differences and considerations in the relationship between education, sex, age, and opioid-related mortality. Finally, the insured population is likely less affected by opioid-related mortality than the American populace overall. What we mean to say by this is that the older, generally more educated insured population is likely less impacted by opioid mortality than the average American. Before we assess the insurance implications of opioid-related mortality, it's important to get a general idea of what is happening in the space of drug mortality in America right now. And the general trend over the past decade is that drug mortality has been rising in the United States. If we turn our attention to this chart on the right, which shows fatalities per year broken down by non-opioid drugs and opioid drugs, a couple of trends emerge. If we look at the blue part of this chart, which shows fatalities caused by non-opioid drugs, we can see that compared to deaths caused by opioid drugs, the fatalities caused by non-opioid drugs have been relatively consistent over the past decade. On the other hand, when we look at the red part of this chart, which shows fatalities caused by opioid drugs like prescription opioids, heroin, or synthetic opioids, we can see that there's been a considerable rise in mortality due to these drugs over the past decade. In fact, it's fair to say that over this time period, the rise of fatalities from opioid drugs have had a considerable impact on the overall drug experience in the United States. In order to better understand how this rising trend of drug and opioid-related mortality may impact the insured population, we looked at a subset of the population which included individuals with a university degree and those over the age of 25. By doing this, we were able to better approximate what may be happening with drug mortality and opioid mortality in the insured population. When we turn our attention to this chart on the right, which shows overdose mortality rates over time, broken down by various types of opioids, we can see that the dynamics of opioid-related mortality are changing over time in the college-educated subgroup. Mortality from all other opioids, that is to say, prescription opioids, has been the leading cause of overdose mortality in the space of opioids. That said, in recent years, this dynamic has begun to change, with synthetic opioids, and to a lesser extent heroin, becoming increasingly relevant in the space of opioid mortality. In fact, in 2017, among college-educated individuals, synthetic opioids replaced prescription opioids as the leading cause of death. When we look at the relationship between sex, age, and mortality, more interesting trends emerge. Generally speaking, the relationship between mortality and age from opioid overdose is generally consistent, with the biggest drop-off in mortality not happening until after the age of 60. That said, when we add sex to the equation and look at mortality among males and females, the situation becomes more complicated. Among males, mortality peaks in youth, with the largest mortality rates being found between the ages of 30 and 40. On the other hand, when we consider female mortality, mortality rises consistently over age, peaking in middle age. Finally, we will turn our attention to the relationship between educational attainment and opioid overdose mortality. Mortality rates are highly correlated with educational attainment, with college graduates experiencing considerably lower risk than other American groups. If we look at this chart on the right, which breaks down mortality rates over time, broken down by various levels of educational attainment, we can see that there's a stark difference in terms of mortality between college-educated individuals and Americans with lower levels of education. In fact, in 2017, people with high school degrees or less experienced 7 times the mortality of people with a college degree. It's important to keep in mind that mortality from opioid overdose deaths has increased across all levels of education over the past decade. However, looking at this graph, it becomes clear that opioid mortality has historically disproportionately impacted people with lower levels of education. With these trends in mind, we can begin to consider the insurance implications of opioid-related mortality. What is clear is that many American communities are impacted by opioid mortality, including communities that have not been as traditionally impacted by drug overdose mortality. That said, the educated and older demographics that traditionally compose the insurance population are less impacted by opioid mortality than the average American. It's difficult to put a price on the impact that opioid mortality has had on the insurance industry and the American populace in general. That said, by using a data-driven approach and a fact-based analysis, insurers and thought leaders can better understand evolving and dynamic mortality trends like opioid-related mortality. In order to learn more about opioid mortality and how opioid mortality may impact the insurance industry, click this link below to see RJ's thought leadership on the subject. Thank you again for watching our video.